In the interior of the northeastern United States during the mid-19th century, family life followed predictable rhythms shaped by agricultural work, the seasons, and the proximity of neighbors. Even before any defined religious identity, homes were centers of production and survival. In states like New York and Michigan, families woke before sunrise. The fire was rekindled on the wood stove, water was drawn from the well, bread was baked by hand, and field tasks required collective organization. Men, women, and children participated in the same domestic work system, each with well-defined yet flexible roles as needed. Among the early observers of the Adventist movement emerging in this environment was Ellen G. White, who recorded in letters and diaries descriptions of daily family life more than abstract theological pronouncements. Her accounts mention mothers concerned with the moral education of their children, fathers attentive to material sustenance, and entire families adapting their routines to the convictions that were forming. These records do not describe communities isolated from the rest of society, but homes embedded in ordinary villages, facing the same economic difficulties, periodic epidemics, and technological limitations of the time. Adventist family life did not begin as an organized institutional structure. After the so-called Great Disappointment of 1844, many who had maintained hope in a renewed interpretation of prophecy returned to their homes in precarious financial conditions. Some had sold property or abandoned businesses to await an event that did not occur as expected. Reorganizing domestic life became a practical priority. Rebuilding bonds, renegotiating debts, and resuming planting required daily discipline. Religious decisions could not be separated from the need to feed the family during the winter. In the following decades, especially after the formal organization of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1863, again in Michigan, family life continued to center on domestic economy. The Sabbath, observed from sunset Friday to sunset Saturday, altered the weekly schedule. Heavier tasks were completed before Friday afternoon. House cleaning, food preparation, and laundry were done in advance. This practice did not create complete social isolation, but it redefined the family calendar. Children learned from an early age to associate time not only with the agricultural seasons but also with the weekly religious cycle. Children's education primarily took place at home until the expansion of Adventist schools in later decades. Before that, formal instruction was irregular and depended on the availability of local schools. Many mothers took on basic literacy. Preserved letters from the period show a constant concern with reading, discipline, and eating habits. The health reform movement, which gained momentum in the 1860s and 1870s, influenced family diets. The reduction in meat consumption and the emphasis on whole grains and fruits were not merely abstract recommendations, but concrete changes in the home kitchen. The role of women in the 19th century. Adventist family reflected both broad cultural patterns and the particularities of the movement. Women wrote articles, organized meetings, and managed household finances. At the same time, they maintained traditional responsibilities of childcare and home maintenance. Personal diaries reveal constant physical exhaustion, especially in large households. Infant mortality was still a frequent reality, and the loss of children appears in family records with sobriety and resignation. Men divided their time between agricultural or artisanal work and local missionary activities. Many acted as itinerant preachers, which implied long absences. During these periods, the stability of the household depended almost entirely on the wife and older children. This dynamic shaped a greater sense of female autonomy than in some other contemporary Protestant groups, although still within the social norms of the 19th century. Religious gatherings often took place in private homes before the construction of dedicated buildings. Living rooms were rearranged to accommodate neighbors, extra chairs were borrowed, and hymns were sung without formal instrumental accompaniment. The home was not only a private space but also a place for community gatherings. This multifunctional use reinforced social bonds and blurred the boundaries between domestic life and religious practice. The westward expansion in America, especially after the establishment of administrative centers in Battle Creek, gradually altered the profile of Adventist families. Urban growth brought new professions, printing presses, health institutions, and schools. Even so, even in the most developed areas, the home remained the core of daily organization. where practical decisions were made in light of the economic and social circumstances of the time. 19th century Adventist family life cannot be understood solely through doctrinal pronouncements. It is revealed in property inventories, harvest letters, illness reports, birth and death records, and schedules adjusted to Friday sunset. It was a life marked by constant work, adaptation, and an attempt to balance emerging convictions with immediate material needs. As the decades progressed and the movement became institutionally consolidated, new tensions and transformations began to emerge within these homes, which until then had remained essentially agricultural and communal. In the 1870s, in small towns in the American Midwest, the daily lives of Adventist families began to reflect broader changes sweeping across the United States. The expansion of railroads shortened distances, newspapers circulated more frequently, and manufactured goods became more accessible. Even so, within the homes, routines maintained a predictable rhythm. Meal preparation followed the rhythm of the wood-burning stove, lighting depended on kerosene lamps, and mail was awaited as the primary link with distant relatives. The home remained the organizing center of life even as Adventist institutions began to consolidate. In Battle Creek, which had become an administrative and publishing hub, many families were directly involved in printing and publishing activities. Men and women worked printing periodicals that circulated throughout the country, such as the Review and Herald, while their children grew up amidst the constant sound of the presses. This proximity to printed production broadened access to reading within the home. Religious books, health treatises, and missionary accounts were read aloud in the evenings when work ceased and the family gathered in the main room. The consolidation of the Health Institute, which would later develop into the Battle Creek Sanitarium, also impacted family dynamics. Concern about dietary habits, personal hygiene, and home ventilation became a frequent topic of conversation at home. Were opened even in winter to allow air circulation. Mattresses were exposed to the sun whenever possible, and simple grain-based recipes gained popularity in kitchens. These practices were not seen as eccentricities, but as rational measures within a context where epidemics of typhoid fever and other diseases were common. Children's discipline followed firm standards, but there was a growing emphasis on moral and intellectual education. With the founding of Battle Creek College in 1874, the possibility of academic training opened up for young Adventists, including women. Not all families could send their children to study, but the mere existence of such an institution altered expectations. Fathers began to plan savings to pay for studies, while mothers encouraged reading and writing as preparation for future opportunities. At the same time, missionary mobility created fragmented households for extended periods. Itinerant preachers traveled for weeks or months, visiting congregations scattered across neighboring states. Preserved letters from this period show wives managing finances, overseeing farms or urban businesses, and making important decisions in their husband's absence. This arrangement strengthened women's administrative capacity, although it also increased the emotional and physical burden on them. Children's participation in work remained essential. Boys helped in the fields, in the workshop, or in the distribution of publications. Girls helped in the kitchen, with sewing, and in caring for younger siblings. The concept of childhood as a prolonged phase of protection was not yet dominant. Practical contribution was part of character formation and family survival. However, diaries reveal moments of simple leisure, walks through the fields, shared reading, and visits to neighbors after sunset. The observance of the Sabbath continued to organize the week. In rural areas, the family often traveled long distances to a meeting place. In larger cities, regular gatherings were held in established buildings. The domestic environment, however, maintained a central role. Preparation for the Sabbath began on Friday morning. Clothes were laid out, meals were cooked in advance, and urgent tasks were completed before nightfall. As sunset approached, the pace of the house deliberately slowed down. Family relationships were also influenced by internal debates within the movement itself. Discussions about organization and institutional authority reached living rooms through periodicals and correspondence. Families talked about administrative decisions made in general assemblies, even when they did not directly participate in them. Information circulated with unusual intensity for a group that was still relatively small. Ellen G. White's records describe visits to homes where hospitality was simple yet thoughtful. She noted details such as the arrangement of the furniture, the quality of the food, and the health of the children. These observations reveal a constant concern for the balance between work, study, and rest. There was no idealization of the domestic environment. There was recognition of concrete difficulties, from debts to interpersonal conflicts. As the decade progressed, institutional growth also brought unexpected challenges. Fires damaged important facilities, requiring reconstruction and financial mobilization. The concentration of members around urban centers created inequalities between families living near institutions and those scattered throughout the countryside. Some enjoyed easy access to schools and medical services. Others remained dependent on limited local resources. Despite these differences, the foundation remained the home organized around work, reading, and weekly discipline. The slow modernization of the United States was beginning to penetrate through the windows of these houses, but it did not eliminate the artisanal character of daily life. Between printing presses, schools, and restrooms, the Adventist family of the late 19th century found itself at a point of transition, maintaining rural traits while adjusting to the growing urbanization that would mark the following decades. As the movement expanded its reach beyond the borders of the American Midwest, new cultural realities would begin to redefine the profile of these homes. In the early 1880s, as the country moved toward an increasingly industrialized economy, many Adventist families still awoke to the same sounds of roosters and wagons on dirt roads. In rural areas of states like Iowa and Ohio, daily life remained tied to the cultivation of corn, wheat, and small home gardens. The difference lay in the growing awareness that they belonged to a movement that was no longer just local. Letters from other states and even other continents began to circulate more frequently, read at the table after dinner, under the flickering light of oil lamps. Missionary expansion to the West Coast altered the horizon for many families. When leaders and workers settled in California, especially around Oakland, a new geographic axis opened up for American Adventism. Some families decided to migrate, selling properties in the Midwest and facing long train journeys. This move was motivated not only by religious convictions, but also by economic opportunities and the prospect of a more favorable climate. The decision to leave involved practical calculations, the cost of the ticket, transporting furniture, and adapting the children to an unfamiliar environment. Within these transitional households, routines needed to be rebuilt. Water supply, proximity to markets, and the availability of urban work demanded new skills. Men who had previously relied exclusively on agriculture began working in workshops, publishing offices, or construction. Women adapted their cooking methods to the local food supply. Fresh fruits became more abundant in California, influencing eating habits already shaped by health reform. At the same time, the circulation of periodicals such as Signs of the Times broadened the sense of belonging to a national network. Children learned to recognize the names of distant cities even before traveling outside the county. Maps hanging on the walls indicated locations where missionaries had been sent. The home became a point of contact with a broader reality, even though the day began in the same way, with simple and repetitive tasks. The decade was also marked by internal debates that resonated in family conversations. The 1888 Assembly, held in Minneapolis, became a recurring topic in Adventist homes. Although many ordinary members were not present, the discussions recorded in the periodicals reached the living rooms. Parents read excerpts aloud and commented on the different positions presented. The home environment functioned as a space for the collective processing of this information, without the formality of the assemblies. Ellen G. White's records during this period reveal constant travel between states and visits to families in diverse economic backgrounds. She describes simple homes, some still under construction, others already established in emerging urban neighborhoods. Her notes mention children attending newly established schools and young people considering teaching or publishing. These accounts offer a fragmented but consistent portrait of the growing diversity within the movement. Formal education gained a more defined place in family life. Parish schools began to emerge in different localities, reducing the exclusive dependence on public institutions. The decision to enroll children in these schools involved financial sacrifices. Many families needed to adjust already tight budgets. Child labor continued to exist, but it began to be reconciled with more structured school schedules. Urbanization also brought new moral and social challenges. In larger cities, exposure to theaters, salons, and other forms of entertainment generated discussions within the home about limits and cultural participation. The response was not uniform. Some households maintained a more reserved stance, while others adopted moderate approaches. What is observed in the records is a constant attempt to balance social inclusion with the preservation of practices considered important. In the late 1880s, international expansion began to directly impact family structure. Missionaries sent to Europe and Australia left wives and children temporarily or took the entire family to unfamiliar places. International correspondence became part of the domestic routine. Waiting for news that crossed the ocean required patience. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, and each envelope received was read repeatedly. As the century drew to a close, Adventist homes reflected this combination of continuity and change. There were still backyard gardens, hand-washed clothes, and quiet nights lit by kerosene lamps. But there were also schools, restrooms, publishing houses, and a missionary network connecting homes scattered across different continents. The family remained the basic unit of organization, gradually adapting to an increasingly interconnected world. With the turn of the century and the accelerated growth of institutions, new structural pressures would begin to further transform the balance between home, work, and community. As the 1890s progressed, the domestic environment of Adventist families could no longer be described solely in rural terms. In cities like Chicago and San Francisco, where small congregations were consolidating, family life was organized in modest apartments or townhouses near railroad lines and shopping centers. The sounds of factories, streetcars, and commerce replaced the silence of the countryside. But the basic structure of the home remained centered on disciplined economy and predictable routine. The household budget required strict control, especially after the economic crisis of 1893, which affected jobs and wages throughout the country. Financial instability reinforced habits of frugality. Clothes were repeatedly mended, furniture was passed down through generations, and food was used to its fullest extent. The practice of urban gardening, when space allowed, supplemented the diet. The influence of health reform ideas, disseminated by institutions such as the Battle Creek Sanitarium, remained present even among those who had never visited Michigan. Pamphlets and articles circulated widely, providing guidance on cereal preparation, the use of whole grains, and dietary moderation. Institutional growth also brought administrative restructurings that had repercussions within the families. In 1901, the reorganization of the denomination in an assembly held, again in Battle Creek, altered how decisions were made and how resources were distributed. Although these events occurred at the organizational level, their effects were felt in daily life. Changes in leadership, transfers of workers, and redefinition of missionary fields meant frequent family displacements. Children changed schools, mothers reorganized kitchens in new homes, and fathers sought sustenance in unfamiliar environments. The fire that struck the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1902 and the fire at the Review and Herald publishing house around the same time had a profound emotional impact. Even families living far away followed the news in the newspapers. There was concern for friends employed at the institutions and uncertainty about the financial future of the movement. In many homes, conversations at the dinner table revolved around reconstruction, debt, and the relocation of activities to other cities. Shortly afterward, the transfer of the administrative center to Washington, D.C., marked a new phase. For many families, this meant a permanent move to the region of the federal capital, or to neighboring cities in Maryland and Virginia. Adapting to the political and urban environment of the East Coast contrasted with the culture of the Midwest. The cost of living was different, job opportunities varied, and interaction with other religious traditions was more intense. Even so, at home, the pattern of organization remained consistent. Set schedules, nightly reading, advanced preparation for the Sabbath, and careful management of expenses. Ellen G. White's accounts from the end of her life record a constant concern for family balance. She describes homes where excessive institutional work left little time for domestic life. She also observes homes where excessive discipline generated tension between parents and children. Her writings, preserved in personal letters, reveal an attempt to guide practical behaviors, always within the cultural context of the time. There is no idealized portrait. There is recognition of human limitations and the pressures imposed by an expanding movement. As the 20th century entered, the generation that had lived through the Great Disappointment was already aging. Their children and grandchildren grew up in a more structured institutional environment, with established schools, organized hospitals, and consolidated publishing houses in different regions. Family life became less improvised than in the early decades. There were school textbooks, administrative calendars, and more uniform patterns of domestic worship. Still, the essence remained tied to the private space of the home, where everyday decisions were made away from assemblies and official reports. The gradual electrification of cities, the popularization of the telephone, and improvements in transportation began to alter domestic rhythms. News arrived faster, travel became more frequent, and isolation decreased. Even so, many Adventist homes preserved habits inherited from the previous century: simple meals, communal reading, and a clear division of responsibilities among its members. Adventist family life in the 19th century, when observed in its entirety, reveals continuity rather than rupture. Professions and institutional scale changed, but the domestic nucleus remained as a space for shared work, moral education, and constant adaptation to the changing economic and social circumstances of the United States. Crossing the border into the new century, these families carried with them practices formed in lamplit kitchens and strengthened by decades of quiet organization within their own homes. Looking at the 19th century in perspective, Adventist family life reveals continuity, discipline, and constant adaptation. Before large institutions, there were simple kitchens, backyard gardens, letters written by lamplight, and decisions made around the table. In states like Michigan and New York, the movement was sustained by homes organized with economic rigor and a strong sense of shared responsibility. Institutions like Battle Creek College and Battle Creek Sanitarium influenced habits and broadened horizons, but it was within homes that beliefs were transformed into daily practice. Fathers, mothers, and children shaped their identity less through public discourse and more through routines repeated week after week. As the century drew to a close, Adventism was already structured and geographically expanded. Even so, its foundation remained the same: ordinary families facing economic crises, relocations, and social transformations, maintaining domestic organization as a central axis of stability. Thus, the history of Adventist family life in the 19th century is, above all, the history of homes that sustained a quietly growing movement over decades.